Rachel. Dying to hear about what you have to say about this. You are a defense attorney. What did you think about his analysis of these two pieces of new evidence, the letter as well as the witness who testified, who's come forward recently and said he was molested by Jose as well?
I think this is very interesting. He had a very strong take that this habeas petition should be denied. Habeas petitions are usually denied, such a high standard to get a new trial. I think he does not want this case retried under his watch. And I do think he's trying to notify the public, a little bit take the temperature of the public, but definitely notify and defend his position that he is going to argue against a new trial being granted for the Menendez brothers. Now, as far as the evidence and what he was saying, I think that his analysis was strong. As far as the corroboration as to state of mind, as to the band members' testimony, I think that could a little bit go either way because it does corroborate perhaps the state of mind of the brothers, meaning that's a corroboration that they were molested. And I think you can probably wield that back to state of mind evidence, but he's not going to admit it. And I think even if he did, that still would not be enough for this DA to argue that a new trial should be granted.
Yeah, as you said, spot on, that these motions are rarely granted. And so I think that he's putting that out there. He wants to deal with this one first before he gets to the resentencing motion in March. You know, it's also interesting because he talked about the credibility of those two pieces of evidence. He said, I want to put it sort of in context of the credibility. He talked about the deceit and lies that Eric and Lyle had a pattern, he said, of throughout from the time that they killed their parents on. He talked about before the planning that they did into killing their parents, but he also talked about 5 different times that they talked about what actually happened. And the first time they said they didn't kill their parents, right? They said it was a mafia hit. That was in the 911 call. The second time they said their father was a violent sexual predator and he had raped his Lyle's girlfriend. Nothing about sexual abuse to them. The third time the father molested Eric, the mother molested Lyle. Then the fourth story was Eric and Lyle were both molested by the father. So it took to the fourth version where they finally got to the version that ended up in court. And then the fifth version, which was in court, father and mother both going to kill Lyle and Eric, and that's why they killed him. So it's very interesting, and because people started asking him about, well, do you believe the sexual abuse or not, right? Because that's really what's been in the headlines. Do you believe that they were sexually abused? And many people are saying, well, if they were sexually abused, then they should be allowed to get out. It seems like he was sort of setting this up for that it really doesn't matter. One, perhaps it's not true that they were sexually abused. And then 2, he kept referring to what Leslie Abramson, their defense attorney, said back at the time of the trial, which was sexual abuse is not a defense to murder. It does not justify murder. We'll never try to claim that. What do you feel about the way he talked about sexual abuse today?
I think he is saying on the elements of the crime, the sexual abuse does not matter because they were not in imminent danger. There was not self-defense. And whether sexual abuse happened or not, these stories have continually changed. So he's really saying on both fronts, it doesn't matter. And are they credible? I think what he is getting at is he's just not buying what they're selling. He is not going to overturn or grant or argue that a new trial should go forward based on the sexual abuse argument because it may not be credible. And also, even if it is, it still is not relevant to whether they killed their parents in this premeditated way.
You know, it was interesting. Someone asked him if he had talked to the brothers about this, and he said that the defense attorneys have not offered them up to him to talk to him. And then he said, you know, it probably wouldn't matter anyways because they've offered letters, et cetera. But as a defense attorney, would you offer that opportunity to the DA to speak in person with Lyle and Eric before he makes his final assessment?
I think that's a really tricky call and a tricky decision that really only the brothers and their defense counsel could go through. It very much depends on what they would say and how they would say it, because they still have their constitutional rights to the Fifth Amendment and to not self-incriminate. So if in that talking, there could be a way they could incriminate themselves and change the evidence to be further against them or or not change Nathan Hoffman's mind, I think that I would probably not offer them up either.
You know, Dr. Phil has been following this case closely. He actually recently sat down with DA Hochman to discuss the amount of work that was going into making this decision. Listen here.
There's got to be thousands of pages of trial transcripts and evidence and all, but you're going to dig through all that yourself.
I've already started. And after I do a thorough review of the facts and the law, then we will come forward with our position on resentencing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, are you surprised at all at how much time that they have spent doing this? It felt like when Gascon was on it before, and there are a lot of people really questioning how he was handling this, that he had not necessarily taken this much time and care in really analyzing the case itself.
This DA is being very thorough with the evidence and applying the facts to the law, and that is what he should be doing. And I think he made a lot of accusations that this was potentially politically motivated when DA Gascon was going through it at really the time of the election. And the Menendez brothers, due to the Netflix special and the shows, it's a very popular subject here in Los Angeles. And so I think what he's brought it back to is taking it out of entertainment, taking it out of public opinion, and bringing it back to a careful analysis of the law.
Well, you're there in LA, so give us a temperature reading on the public. Do you think that this presentation today that he did will help people sort of pull back and look at it again? Or do you think people have made up their minds there and they want the brothers out?
I think he in part did this presentation because this is not a popular viewpoint. I think it is a more popular viewpoint to support a resentencing or letting the brothers out, which he hasn't said he's not going to do. So he didn't particularly address the resentencing, but to say they're still evaluating that, and that has to do with rehabilitation. And that would be a different set of laws and standards that he would be applying for that. On the habeas, I think he was careful to explain to the public how that is different and how he's supporting his opinion, because again, he is in an elected position too, and this is not particularly the most popular position, I would say, right now.
You know, and it's interesting, Rachel, the fact that the resentencing hearing is really looking at totally different things. It looks at the rehabilitation, what they've done since they've been in prison, more of a, you know, a fairness, mercy type analysis. And from everything that we've heard and everything that we've seen from the defense, they have stellar records in prison, right? And we even heard from them in a podcast just yesterday. The two brothers talked in this podcast, Two Angry Men, and they talked about how they'd been bullied and you know, traumatized in prison, but they wouldn't react, they wouldn't fight back. They really did a lot to try and do well in prison and do better. But on the other hand, he's now sort of raising this credibility question about them, right? He's saying essentially that they've put forward new evidence that isn't credible in his mind. Do you think that that will impact his assessment of the resentencing factors?
I do. I think that they are setting this up for a potential denial of a resentencing. And I think that is a very possible thing that could happen. And that is not a popular viewpoint right now. So I think that the DA is taking this in phases and spoon feeding the public a bit as to what their position might be. And in this exact filing that they did, not recommending that the habeas be granted, they are setting up that the brothers are simply not credible and that they still may not be credible. And that may then play a part later when we look at how they're evaluating the resentencing. I agree with you.
You know, it was interesting in that podcast, the Fox News reported that in the podcast, Eric said, quote, "Prison was hard for me. I faced a lot of bullying and trauma. It was a dangerous environment." He's talking about it in the past tense, essentially. It's interesting, sort of a glimpse into his mind, perhaps, you know, with the groundswell of public opinion going in their favor, that they are set up in their minds, perhaps, to thinking that they're going to be released on this resentencing hearing. Is that sort of the feeling there in Los Angeles?
Well, I think under Gascon, things were really headed that way. It was looking like they might be released by Christmas. And that DA was very supportive of what looked like a resentencing that was for time served and that they got out. And I think what is happening now after the election and when a new DA came in, under DA Hochman, this is looking like he's went way back to the beginning and they really can't count on anything, but they need to change their mind too, because think of the roller coaster ride that the brothers are going on in prison.
Mm-hmm. And this really sort of all started with that the two documentaries essentially that dropped on Netflix last year, with the Monsters one by Ryan Murphy, and then the other one, the Menendez brothers. That was more factual. The Monsters one was more of a dramatic series on it, but it really got people talking and focused much more, I think, on the sexual abuse allegations. And obviously now, 30 years later, we are in a different society as far as understanding and accepting allegations of abuse. And even Gavin Newsom, he talked on a podcast and he said, I know all about this case because he had been watching he had heard about the documentary as well. How much do you think that is influencing what's going on now? It doesn't seem like this DA is really paying attention to that, but what about the judge, right?
I think that's what started this groundswell again. I mean, they've gone through multiple habeas motions and no one has really paid attention to that. But the Netflix, the Monsters and the documentary absolutely got people talking, and it looked like they were brutalized by their father. So there was a lot of sympathy going into what then became the DA grabbing on to those facts and beginning this possible issue of having them resentenced and released. And I do think there's a saying that there's a new sheriff in town. And I think that is what this DA is reasserting, that he's starting back at the beginning and taking away maybe popular opinion, what entertainment is bringing us, and really focusing on facts and law.
It's interesting, Rachel, because I was prosecuting back in the 80s, so I've really seen this evolution of the criminal justice system going through bringing in entertainment, right, and true crime and documentaries, and sometimes it has a good impact on these cases because it brings awareness, and sometimes it can really push public opinion a certain way, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. But today, watching this DA today, bringing it back to the law and bringing it back to the evidence and literally laying it out for people as to how it fits together in his analysis and making it so transparent, I think was a refreshing way to remind people that this really is looking at the facts and looking at the law and seeing where that takes you, as opposed to what you might see, dramatized on television. Do you ever worry about that as a defense attorney, as far as the direction that we've been going in recently?
I do, and I think people are swayed, and you get away from actual facts and how we're looking at the law. And I think that it was a bit of a message, not only for this case, but for other cases, that this is how the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office is now going to be run, that it's not going to be swayed. We're also in Hollywood, so it's not going to be swayed by Hollywood. It's going to focus on what is real. But it's also the same District Attorney's Office that just lost the ASAP Rocky case, where there was a lot of perhaps similar ideas and prosecutorial discretion and in really bringing that case as hard as they did. So there's a lot going on, and you can't avoid popular opinion. And here in Hollywood, it's also hard to avoid celebrity and entertainment and how that affects our community.
Yeah, and that's a great point you brought up, because I heard one of the reporters ask him about ASAP Rocky, and he said, we're not talking about that today. We're talking about the Menendez case today. I want to play for you a part of a clip from the podcast. I believe this is Eric Menendez talking about how he was bullied in prison. And this is the podcast, Two Angry Men. He's talking to Harry Levin, who is from TMZ, and also Mark Garagos, who is their defense attorney. Those are the two hosts of the podcast. Listen to this.
I was picked on, bullied violently, and it was traumatic, and it was continual. And, there's the things that a lot of inmates in prison go through, and when they're not part of a gang structure and they come in and they're basically lone wolf, they just have to be by themselves. And So it added a great deal. Prison can be hard, and there's a lot of suffering in prison. And I remember the day that I was told Lyle just got assaulted and got his jaw broken, and it was, I'm thinking, he's over there, I'm going through this over here, and at least we could protect each other maybe if we were together, but we were not even allowed to be together. So it was difficult.
You know, Rachel, they brought up a lot about how they were separated. I think for 21 years in prison, they were not allowed to be together. They talk about that in the documentaries. But also, you know, reminding people that they committed this crime together, right? They worked together. They planned the alibi together. They went and bought the guns together. They shot their parents together. Do you think that it's effective there, what they're talking about there, about in the podcast, about being bullied in prison and how difficult? Do you think that raises sympathy for them? And why do you think they're doing this right now? Why do you think they're talking like this so publicly right now?
Well, they're trying to sway the public so that the DA, again, an elected official, will see it their way or perhaps go with what a popular opinion would be. As far as sympathy, I think it really depends on how you see this case. If you're looking at them as two co-conspirators who murdered people, it's not so weird to think of them as being separate. If you're thinking of them as two family members who have also lost the rest of their family, albeit by their own hands, and are two young men in prison really just trying to get through after years and years and years of sexual abuse at the hands of their parents, then you are going to find it sympathetic. But it really depends on how you're viewing this case going in, and how you're viewing this case going in may also depend on what media you're watching and how you're viewing the Netflix show or their credibility. So there's a lot going into all of this, and I think they are just looking to see if there's anywhere they can get the support from the public and see how that sways this DA's office.
Well, you know, it was a fascinating development today in a case that really has captured people's attention for so many years, decades now. Rachel Rizza, thank you so much for being here with us today. And we will have more on this story tonight on the news on Merit TV at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 Central. And I will see you then. Thanks for watching.